welcome to yet another horror of Netflix, and today we will be reviewing not maybe exactly a horror film,
Yes.
It's kind of a horror film. It's certainly a lot of horrific things happening in it.
Oh boy, yeah.
The Toxic Avenger Part 1.
Yeah, this one is about a particularly nebbishy young man called Melvin who works at the...
Nebbishy, that's good, I like that.
I thought that was a good word for it. He
He's
works
a
at
dweeb.
he's a proper 80s dweeb,
Yeah,
let's be honest. He works at the Tromaville Health Club as a cleaner, and he attracts the ire of some psychotic jocks who decide to play a particularly cruel prank on him involving a sheep and lipstick. Of course, this goes rather disastrously wrong. I say wrong. I mean, they find it hilarious, but Melvin runs away from them, jumps out of a window, and lands in the vat of toxic waste, which just
uncovered vat of toxic waste in the back of a truck.
Happened to be outside at that exact moment.
Sheep and lipstick is actually a coming of age thing in Scotland.
I thought you were going to say it was
Quiet
the name
about
of a
that,
pub.
Callum. That's on the download, much like the truth about haggis.
I thought you were going to say it was the name of a pub, like the Sheep and Lipstick. but
Edinburgh Gay Bar.
I'm not going to judge. But the train of thought I had has just left the station, I think. But yeah, no. Although he is horribly burnt and disfigured by his toxic bath,
it causes him to develop, I think, air bladders under his skin.
Yeah,
quite drastically.
It's quite a horrible scene, really. They play like the night in Bald Mountain. His skin expands and warps. He dips himself in a bath to try and wash it off.
Screen goes flips to negative quite a few times, which is an effect that Troma are quite fond of.
Big one for them.
And he becomes
the Toxic Avenger.
Now the Toxic Avenger obviously fights crime and he gets his revenge, as hinted at.
Yeah,
by the title,
as the name suggests.
On the jocks who are more than just sort of your usual clean cut smart ass jocks. To give you an idea of the kind of film it is, they run over a small boy and then reverse over his head to crush his head and then take photos of the body, and later on something really unpleasant happens with between one of the ladies and those photos.
No.
So they're not very nice people.
Yeah.
So they do to some extent deserve what happens to them. But the Toxic Avenger himself, I don't think is really quite blameless in all this, because for such a likable, and he is a really likable kind of superhero, he's a really violent bastard.
Quite a cruel film.
He is. It's not like he's not your Batman never kill. He's not like your Superman truth, justice, and the American way. This is a guy that pins someone down under some weights in the gym and crushes his head for kicks.
Do I remember right that he rips a man's arms off and beats him with it? Or?
Yeah, I think that happens. It certainly happens in one of the films. There's in one of the films, maybe Toxic Avenger Part 4. We're not going to get into Toxic Avenger Part 4 too much, but I do remember his nemesis, the noxious offender, shows up and he rips off a policeman's arms and swings the arms around, and the dying policeman falls to his knees and shouts, "Look out, he's armed." And that's quite representative of the humour in these films. Ridiculously violent and sexual grotesqueness mixed with sort of childish puns and cartoonish jokes, and it's very odd, very low budget for the most part, but every so often they come out with something and you're like, how did they afford to do that? I don't know if it's just the difference.
Quite impressive.
Especially the car crashes and stuff. I mean, I think a lot of that's maybe a testament to the how much health and safety potentially has changed since the late 70s between then and now. And I kind of you got to kind of like Toxie. He's a bit of a flag flyer for unconventional people. In a lot of ways, he's
kind of a weird image as well, because at the time of his horrible accident, because reasons, he was wearing a ballet tutu, and this becomes
all related to the sheep and the lipstick.
Because of course this becomes his superhero costume in a way. So you've got this towering giant man in a purple ballet tutu coming to
it's mostly dissolved though. It's mostly like
bits of it.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that kind, because I don't have a massive amount of experience with Troma generally, would you describe them as makers of exploitation films? Would you say this was an exploitation film?
Yeah, but they're not really your typical exploitation film, because they're quite knowing, and the problem I always found with Troma, actually, and I do kind of like trauma films, but they get more knowing as they go on. The Toxic Avenger was being clever because they hadn't really done anything like that before much. But as they went on, they became that times a million, and they became really known and tongue in cheek. I liked them back in the days of the Toxic Avenger and Class of Newcomb High and all these films where they're not, their tongue's in their cheek, but it's not up their ass.
Yeah,
you know,
there's not a sense of humour about it. It's not like spoof or anything. Yeah.
They're not just regurgitating themselves, but I'd say they are makers of exploitation films, but it's a very specific flavour of exploitation. You don't really get many other places. Maybe films like Street Trash almost come close to touching on the kind of vibe of a trauma movie, but there's a very specific flavour. It smells a little bit like shit, but it's not quite that comes with trauma pictures. But it's a very it was actually bizarrely for such a film that's just as perverted and grotesque as the Toxic Avenger is. It spawned a children's TV series. Do you remember the kids' TV series growing up?
I don't remember actually seeing it, but I was reading that afterwards, and I was thinking that's got to be one of the most unlikely kids' spin-offs.
It really is.
Got to be up there with RoboCop.
I suppose you got to kind of think that this was the 80s, and during the 80s, there was a lot of really inappropriate kind of toy lines and cartoon series made of things like RoboCop, Rambo. Where all these characters were kind of were softened for a children's audience, but the Toxic Avenger, a film where a woman masturbates to the crushed head of a small boy, to be made into a children's TV show.
That's going the extra mile.
It's okay though, folks, because Toxie catches her and then sits her down on top of the hot coals in a sauna, burning her legs off. So.
I mean,
justice is done, believe me.
Well, that's one thing I was going to say, because I think the attitudes of it are very, I kind of want to say right wing. It's got that kind of might makes right kind of quality.
It's funny though, because as I was saying, it's kind of a mixed message, because Toxic Avenger is this big hulking hideous monster in a tutu who's obviously the hero of the film, so there's almost a kind of like, we don't care what you look like. Anything goes, and we support anyone of any sort of orientation or whatever, as long as they're on the right side of the law. But then on the other side of it, as soon as you cross that line of committing a crime, we're going to rip your head off and shove it up your ass, or crush your head in a machine, or like I think in Toxic Avenger Part 3, I think it is, he takes a criminal and puts his hand in a video machine and switches the TV on, and inexplicably the TV shows the insides of the VCR. I don't know why. I've never seen a VCR that actually shows the insides of the VCRs it plays. And you see a video of the guy's hand getting all mangled and chopped up in the heads of the video machine and getting like ripped through. And this is played for laughs, and Toxic Avenger's cracking jokes through the whole thing. But Toxic's really nice guy. He doesn't marry. Does he marry her? He falls in love with a blind girl because she doesn't know any better.
Who is also possibly beautiful,
Yeah. Spends a lot of time with her, with like sort of in bikinis, with her legs akimbo. There's a lot of disembowelments. It's just a hideously violent film. It is funny, it is entertainment, but it is. Yeah, it does sort of veer from being quite left wing and quite kind of very accepting to being very right wing and like, we're gonna, if you commit a crime, we're gonna tear you apart.
It's quite a bizarre combination. I mean, it's. Oh god, I was going to say something there. Now I've lost my train of thought.
Dead air, Alan.
Yeah.
Pressure's on. Time's a ticking. I do enjoy it. It is good. It is similar to Trauma's other films. If you have that sense you've seen Trauma films, but you've not seen Toxic Avenger, you really probably should, because it is the archetype that all other Trauma films were then spun off.
I remember what I was going to say now. It's just, I think the way they play it with this film, I think is not something that would get made now. I think it's just it's so kind of over the top and kind of gung ho. It does feel so much part of its day in that regard. But I think the only kind of modern I'm saying that, but I think the only modern parallel I can really think of is maybe Hobo with a Shotgun, which I think
Hobo with a Shotgun's got a trauma sort of element to it. Yeah, it's a bit more soul searchy, I think, than a trauma film, but it has a similar vibe. And I think things that came, I think probably Hobo with a Shotgun owes a lot to Trauma. That whole, because Trauma in a way is maybe the epitome of that grindhouse spirit, just churning out movies. After they made Toxic Avenger, they made a bundle with the Toxic Avenger. It played for something like a year or 2 years in New York City, and they made shitloads of money out of it, and they kind of squandered a lot of that on movies like Troma's War, which was a war movie that they made, and it's all a lot of things in a similar vein. Latterly, they've been kind of like mooching off their own sort of style, becoming Troma, doing Troma, and it becomes just ridiculously over the top. But Toxic Avenger, there's a kind of weird innocence to it, and amongst
there's something kind of oddly earnest about it. It's kind of endearing,
which is quite is endearing, and it's worth. I think it makes it worth a look, even if you're going to watch one Troma film, make it a Toxic Avenger. I think.
I mean, I think I did feel that it maybe overstayed its welcome a little bit towards the end, but yeah.
The sequels were interesting as well, as I've kind of touched on a little bit. They made 2 back-to-back with a much bigger budget, and then they were quite good, but they softened it a lot, and then part 4 just went, it was one of the later Troma films, and they just went mental with it. There was, he gets a black sidekick who's just a severed head. That's how far it goes, you know. But
I'm not sure if that's a token thing or if that's just
it's just bizarre. But and apparently Troma have now sold the rights to do a remake, and I believe at one point Arnold Schwarzenegger was being touted as playing Toxie in a PG-13 remake of the Toxic Avenger. But Troma are also talking about doing their own sequel alongside that, so you'll end up with a cinematic PG-13 Toxic Avenger movie and a Toxic Avenger 6 on video, probably, just to confuse people. It'll be like the extreme of, like, you know, asylum films where they come out with like snakes on a train or something like that, but it'll actually have the same title, and grandmothers will buy it for their children, and it'll have someone eating a fucking afterbirth or something in it.
I'm just waiting for a family to buy their kids the Toxic Avenger because they're into the Avengers.
Oh, the Toxic Avengers. Yeah, there you go. But do you remember the Toxic Crusaders was the name of the TV program?
Oh, right.
And I was aware of Toxie just through the Toxic Crusaders when I was a kid, and then the Blockbuster near me when I was growing up got all these Troma films in out of nowhere, and among them was the Toxic Avenger. I remember thinking, why is there I didn't know there was a Toxic Crusaders movie. Why is it called the Toxic Avenger? Where are the other Toxic Crusaders? And why is it an 18? Yes. It took a while to get those answers, but it takes a strong stomach and a pretty flexible sense of humour. But again, as I say, if you're going to watch one Troma film, it has to be the Toxic Avenger, I would say.
Yeah, I would go along with that. I mean, the only other Troma film I've actually seen is Sergeant Kabuki Man, but by all accounts, I remember virtually nothing about it.
Sergeant Kabuki Man doesn't get his own sequel, but he's also a sidekick of Toxie in Toxic Avenger Part 4, so he kind of gets his own sequel, but he's played by a different actor who isn't actually an actor, just some guy.
Just happened to be like in a
just
Kabuki
some guy
play.
in a mask that can't act, but it is Sergeant Kabuki Man, so yeah. Cheers!
The fucking way end of it.